Hi everyone, in this lesson we're going to talk about adding forms to your web page. Now this is important because when you add a form to a web page, it allows the visitors of your web page to send you data. So I'm sure you've all seen forms on web pages before, and it's real important for us as developers because a lot of times we're working with that data that users enter into a form. Okay, so let's go on over to Sublime Text. And let's create a new file in our HTML folder. So I'll right click on the HTML folder, choose new file, and let's do Control S to save it, and we'll just save it as html-forms.html. Hit save there, and we'll go ahead and put in the boilerplate code. So I'll use the HTML snippet trick. So type in HTML and then hit tab, and let's go ahead and indent the head element and the body element so we get everything formatted nice and neat here. We'll add a title, so we'll just call it forms, and I'll also add an H1 element inside the body that says the same thing. Whoops, H1, there we go, and that can just say HTML forms or something like that as well too. Okay, so if you want to add a form to a page, you add a form element. So we'll start right here, right underneath the H1 element. So go ahead and type in form and hit tab. So everything that's in between the opening form tag and the closing form tag is going to be part of this form. Now there is one more thing that I forgot here. We need to, I've added some styles that I want applied to this form. So what I want you to do here, now we haven't gotten to this part, so this may not be super clear to you, but go into the head element, underneath the title element, let's add a link element here. So type in LINK and hit tab, and we want to set the href attribute so that it links to our sample CSS file right here. Whoops, it's in the styles folder. We want to link to this file right here. Okay, so in order to do that, the path should look like this. We want to go up a folder, and then we want to go to the styles folder like that, and then /, and the file is called sample.css, just like that. Okay, let's go ahead and save this, Control S, and then open it in the browser. So right click on the background, choose open in browser, and here it is right here. And if your H1 element looks red, that means that you've linked to your style sheet properly. So now I've added a few other styles that will control the way the form looks, but don't worry about that. We'll get to it once we talk about CSS. Okay, let's get back to our form element, which is inside the body here. Let's go ahead and add a label element. So here's a new one for us. So put your cursor right in between the opening and closing form tags and make sure you're indented, and type in label. And this is going to be a label for an input here. So this will be for the user's first name. So type in first name here, just like this, and you can put a colon there if you'd like. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add an input for a user to enter their first name. So the element that we want to use for that is called input. So type in input and hit tab. And now you can see right away that Sublime Text entered two attributes for us. And the first one is going to be the type attribute, and let's set that to a value of text, T-E-X-T. That'll make a text box input. And let's give it a name. Let's give the name attribute a value of first name. All one word, just like that. Actually, let's be particular here. Let's put a capital N there. We'll go with some camel case. I haven't explained camel case yet, but we'll see it later in the course. So what you should have here for the value of the name attribute is first name with no spaces, and then a capital N here for name. And we'll talk about that, that naming convention called camel case later in the course. Let's save our changes, Control S, and let's Alt Tab back over to the browser here and hit refresh. And what did I do wrong? I forgot to save my changes here. So back in Sublime Text, keep an eye on that little ball right there. I'll press Control S, and now you can see I've saved my changes. That ball has turned to an X. So I'll Alt Tab back over to the browser and hit refresh, and there's the beginning of our form right there. You can see the label element, and then you can see the input element, and we'll be seeing more input elements. This one happens to have its type attribute set to text, which makes it a text input. I'll show you what the name attribute does in a little bit here. Let's go ahead and add one more attribute to this. It's going to be an ID attribute. So we'll add ID, that's the name of the attribute, and we'll set that equal to this, txt first name, just like that. Now I know this is weird, I'm kind of throwing camel case in your face without explaining it, but pay attention to the capitalization here. The ID, the value of the ID attribute here is txt, and then capital F first, and then capital N name, all one word, just like that. Now the ID attribute is going to come into play later in the course, so we'll talk about that. Let's go ahead and add a button so that people can submit the form. We'll add a submit button right here. So to do that, let's put a line break right here, so a BR element right underneath our input element from above, and we're going to add another input element, but this time it's going to have a different type attribute. So type in input and hit tab. Now let's set the type attribute to a value of submit. That's going to create a button for submitting our form. And we don't need to, in this case, we don't need the name attribute, but what we do want to do is add a value attribute. So type in value and set that equal to save or send. We'll go with save here. Okay, so go ahead and save this, Control S, and then if you Alt Tab back over to the browser and hit refresh, there's our save button. And it says save on the button because we set that value attribute. So that's basically, when you're working with buttons, you use the value attribute to put a label on the button. That's why it says save right here. Okay, now let's go back to Sublime Text. Let's go back and add an attribute to our form element here. So actually we're going to add two attributes. First, I want to add an action attribute to the form element. So action equals, and then your pair of quotation marks. Now I want you to use this URL for your action, and I'll explain in just a minute here. So I've just pasted in the value of the action attribute. It's kind of a big long URL, so you're gonna have to eyeball it really good. Make sure you get all the capitalization correct and the spelling and everything just like I have it here. So this is a special page that I have on my web server that will basically process form information and just regurgitate it to you in a page so you can see what data is being sent here. Okay, the way forms work in HTML is that when the user presses the submit button, the data that is entered into the form gets sent to whatever this URL is right here. So I've got this is a URL to a web page that will process the data and show it to us. Now there is one more attribute that we need to add before we try this out. So go ahead and put your cursor up there in the opening form tag after the action attribute, and let's add an attribute called method. Now I'm not going to talk too much about this attribute now. We'll get into it later in the course, especially if you take the advanced web programming courses with me. But what I want you to do is set the value of the method attribute to post, just like this. Oops, let me turn off my word wrap here so you can see a little bit better. So there you go. So add that method attribute and set it equal to post. Now we can go ahead and try it out. So we'll save this, go back over to the browser, go ahead and enter, we'll refresh this, and I'll enter Bob here. That'll be my name for today, and then press the save button. And here's what you should see. Now this is the page that I set up on my web server to receive this form data. But that's the way forms work in HTML, is when you press the submit button for the form, the data should get sent to wherever the action attribute is pointing to, the URL of the action attribute. And you can see here the name attribute that we added back in the HTML becomes the label for the data. So that's important. Let me show you that here in the code. So there's our name attribute that we added before, and that gets sent along with the form data so that it can serve as a label. So that's why we see this here, the first name label, and that got entered as Bob. Let's go ahead and add a few more inputs to this form. So I actually want to put them right here above our submit button. So put your cursor above the BR element there, and let's go ahead and add a checkbox. But we'll add a label first. So type in the label right here, and we'll give it a label of, let's see here, agree to our terms. You've seen that before, where you have to check a box to agree to the terms of service for a website. So we'll kind of simulate that here. So that will be our label, and then underneath that label we'll go ahead and add another input element. So type in input and press tab. Now this one, the type attribute is going to be set to checkbox, just like that. And we'll give it a name of agreed. That will be our label that we see when the data gets sent to the web server. And we'll also give it a value attribute, and we'll set that equal to yes here. So that's the way your input element should look. Let's go ahead and save our changes here, and then go back over to the browser. Now in the browser, let's hit the back button to go back to our form, and let's also hit refresh here. You know what I want to do? Let's add another BR element here. So let's bounce back over to Sublime Text, and let's put a BR element before the label. So right there. Okay, we'll save that. Go back over to the browser and hit refresh, and now we're kind of spacing things out with the line breaks. Our form doesn't look that good, but we'll learn how to make it pretty later. Okay, go ahead and type in a name, and then go ahead and check the checkbox right here and press the save button, and there you should see now there's the name attributes, and here are the values. So we actually hard coded the value to our checkbox, and that's why it says yes. So let's go back here and let's uncheck the checkbox and see what happens when we press save now. See it now, it's not even included in the sent data. That's something that we'll wrestle with in the advanced classes, but for now you don't need to worry about it. Let's go back over to Sublime Text here, and now we're going to add some more stuff. We want it to be before the button. We want the button to be at the bottom of the form, so I'm going to put everything right here, and I'm going to go ahead and add another BR element, and then we'll put in the rest of our code right here. So I'm going to paste this in, but this is what I want you guys to type here. I'll try and clean this up a little bit. So this is what you guys need to add. You can pause the video and type that in if you want, but what I've got here is a label and then 3 input elements. So here's what I'll do. I'll set this up like this so you can see it, and that's what you need to type, those 4 lines right there. Okay, now once you've done that, go ahead and save your changes. Control S. What we've got here are 3 inputs. They happen to be radio buttons, and let's see how they work, and then we'll talk about them a little bit. So I'll tab over to the browser and hit the back button to go back to our page that we're working on, and here are your radio buttons. So go ahead and choose a pizza topping and hit save, and then you should see that there's our data for the pizza topping of choice. Now let's look at the code real quick here. So notice that all 3 of these radio buttons here have a name of pizza. Now that's how you can get radio buttons to work together as a group. That's why if you notice the behavior of these radio buttons, go back here, these are all grouped because they all have the same name the same value for their name attribute. And what that means is if I select one radio button in the group, then all the others will become deselected. So that's how you want to make sure you set a radio button, a group of radio buttons to all have the same value for the name attribute, and that's how the browser knows that they work together as a single group. And notice here that the data that gets actually sent to the page that handles all this data on my web server is determined by the value attribute. Now let's just say we want the pepperoni to be the default radio button when the form gets loaded in the page. So let's add an attribute right here. It's called checked, and we'll set it equal to true, just like that. So now if you hit Control S to save and go back over to the form in the browser, go ahead and I'll refresh the page here, and you should see that it should default to pepperoni being selected. If I select sausage and then reload the page, it'll default back to our pepperoni radio button, and that is because we set its checked attribute to true here. Okay, let's talk about drop-down lists. So if you want to add a drop-down list to a form, you can do it like this. Again, I'm going to paste in the code here and have you type it on your own, just so you don't have to watch me fumble through typing it. But before I do, I'm just going to add a BR element right here. Our form isn't very pretty, but I guess it doesn't have to be at this point. So we're going to go ahead and paste. I'll paste in some code here and you can type it in. Okay, there it is. Have a good look at it. What I've got here is a select element, and you can see that it has an ID. We'll talk about the IDs more later, but you'll want to type that in nice, just how I have it here. It's got a name attribute set to color, so that's going to be the value, that's going to be the label that gets sent up to the server when we send this data in. And then we also have 3 option elements inside of that select element, and you'll see how this works here. After you get done typing up this code here, go ahead and press Control S to save it, and then Alt Tab over to the browser, and let's refresh this page, and here's our drop down list. So, and here are the options that are inside the select element. So if you want to add a drop down list, you use a select element and you put option elements inside of it. Let's go ahead and pick one of these. I'll just pick blue right here and then press save, and you can see now this is interesting. Here's the name attribute. We set that to color, and remember the name attribute becomes the label for the data that gets sent to the web server, but this has a value of 2. Now let's look at our code here. We actually, what we're sending to the web server is the value attribute right here. Now I could go ahead and make each one of these the same as what we see inside the option. So I could turn this one into red, and then we'd be sending the actual color names. But as we move through this course and other courses in the program here, you'll find that a lot of times you want to send numbers for your values, because these numbers will be used in a database. So I don't want to talk about it too much right now, but just be aware that what gets sent here when you use a select element is the value of the selected option. So that's why you're seeing the numbers over here. So in this case, our database would know that color number 2 is blue, and we'll get into that later. Okay, one more to show you and then we're done for the day. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to paste this in right here, and I'll fix the formatting here. What I've got here, whoop, and I will also add a BR element above those, just like that. Okay, so these are the 3 lines that I've added. I put them underneath our select element. I've got a label for comments, and what I have here is a text area element. Now this is for a large text box where you could type in like a paragraph or something like that. Okay, notice the name attribute is set to comment, so that's going to be the label that goes along with the data that gets entered into this text area. We'll see that in a minute, but go ahead and save your changes here, and Alt Tab over to the browser. I'll hit the back button so we can go back to our form, and you can see here's our text area right here. Now it's not very pretty, but I can enter lots of data into it. So I'll just type in a whole bunch of garbage right here and press the save button, and we'll see here it is. So again, here's the name, the value of the name attribute. We set that to comments, and that's important because you need to send those labels along with the data, because if you don't, the web server that handles this data won't know if this is the first name or last name or whatever. So that's why we want to make sure we set those name attributes so that we have labels that go along with the data that we're sending. Okay, so there's a flyby of HTML forms. Like I said earlier in the video, these are important because we're going to be working with these a lot throughout the program, because we're going to be processing a lot of data entered by users. So there you have it. Make sure you read the article that goes with this video to pick up on all the things I forgot to say in